Okay, now I'm back. So thank you everyone for joining us. We have a great meeting today with some really wonderful speakers. So I will introduce them each separately before they present. But our first speaker is Anneliese Vance-Sherman. And Annalise has served as the regional labor economist with the Employment Security Department since February 2010. Her region includes King, Snohomish, Whatcom, Skagit Island, and San Juan counties. Annalise works closely with economic and workforce development partners, local governments, businesses, and the media in Northwest Washington and statewide, providing local labor market intelligence to help inform strategic decision-making. In addition to her work with the state, Annalise serves on several boards and advisory committees, including several local school districts and colleges, the Pacific Northwest Regional Economic Conference, and the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University. Prior to her state service, Annalise was a visiting fellow at the Border Policy Research Institute, an instructor at the College of Business and Economics at Western Washington University. Annalise has a PhD in economic geography and a master's degree in economics from both the State University of New York at Buffalo. So welcome, Annalise. Thank you for being here today. I am going to ask everyone that is not speaking, I think you're all muted already. You're so experienced at this. So I will hand it over to Annalise.
All right, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share some slides here, so bear with me. Hold on one moment. Of course, it doesn't want to. Let me make sure I've got that. Okay. All right, is everybody able to see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, thank you for the introduction and the invitation to be here today. I'm going to give just a little bit of context before I move forward as far as what to expect in this presentation and kind of where I'm coming from. So as a regional labor economist with the state, I work for the Employment Security Department. We're best known for unemployment insurance, especially this past couple of years, and our connections in the workforce development system. But I think it's also important to recognize we've got this little shop that I'm a part of that is partnered with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what this means, what this basically means is that when you're hearing about the unemployment rate, when you're hearing about what's happening with different industry trends, you're hearing about this at a national level from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when you're hearing about it locally every month, you're hearing about it in partnership, both Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Employment Security Department. As a regional labor economist, my job is basically to work with anybody in Washington state who has a need for labor market information to help navigate some of the questions that arise in the field about the state of the labor market. And certainly this past couple of years, there's been a lot to talk about. So with that, I'm going to provide kind of a discussion over the next half hour that looks at the Washington state economy. I will be touching upon Camano Island and Island County in general, but I'm going to go ahead and preface this with, there's been a lot going on. And when we're working with sample-based data, my tendency is to want to scale up as far as it makes sense to scale up to get a robust story that's not going to jump around too much. And with all of the activity that's been happening this year, most of my conversation is going to be focused on that statewide level, just because the story is more cohesive because of the sample size that we're working with. So that's kind of my rationale for working through the data this way. So what we'll be talking about is, what has happened over the past couple of years. First thing I want to just point out with this visual here, this is looking at employment in Washington state as a whole, just the head count of number of jobs. And the first thing I want to point out is the graph on the left goes back to 1990. And you can see whenever we have a major economic reset, when we have a recession, you can see that build up, that pause at the top, that decline, and then kind of pausing at the bottom for a little while, almost a wave-like pattern that we see until we get to 2020. So 2020, we're building up. We've got the longest economic recovery on record since we started measuring economic recoveries. And it looks almost like a break-in series. One day we are at the highest level of employment that we've ever experienced. And the following month, which would be April and May of 2020, we were down where we were in 2013. So, just a highly unusual event. And I mean, we all have lived through it. We know this is a highly unusual event, but I think just that visual of what the data looks like tells us a lot about how unusual this event is. The other thing I'd really like to focus on, and for the purposes of this conversation, I'm really going to be looking at the tail end here. Yes, that drop is a critical part of the story, but what I'm really interested in is how that moves forward. And what you're going to see here is, again, a very different pattern. As economists, we're used to looking at history and assuming that history is going to repeat itself. And if history was going to repeat itself the way that it usually does during a recession, we would have had a little time at the bottom and then kind of that slow build up again, that wave-like motion. And instead we experienced this V-shaped recovery, especially early on, with a little bit of slowing. I'll also point out that we are not fully recovered in terms of the number of jobs yet. We're on track. It's looking like we will have the same number of jobs that we had in 2020 before the recession hit at some point during 2020. And that's what the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council is also projecting, is that we'll be back to that benchmark in this year. But what I'm seeing when I look at this is a lot of different stories. And the first thing I notice is this V-shaped recovery. We had this huge loss, about nearly 400,000 jobs lost in one fell swoop. And then we bounce back pretty quickly in June, and basically almost every single month since June of 2020, we've seen job gains. But what happened right here is I'm seeing in that quick recovery, a lot of resilience, a lot of innovation, businesses quickly retooling and figuring out how to navigate a highly uncertain environment. We're seeing PPP loans being distributed. We're seeing plexiglass going up, people figuring out how do that masks are going to help us navigate in this highly uncertain environment. A lot of innovation happening and a lot of progress moving forward. I will also point out, I did not include the slide, that also slowed. You can only get the loans out so many times. You can only put up plexiglass so many times and put the stickers on your floor so many times. There's a lot of innovation, and it's been continuing forward, but slowing down. I think it's also important, I put this slide up here from screen capture from the Department of Health. It's important to acknowledge that COVID is still with us. And as much as the policies around COVID are one thing, but the way that people are reacting and interacting with this risk of COVID has also made a big difference. And you'll see in one of the next slides that even before we started seeing policies put in place about COVID, we saw some of the effects starting to trickle in as early as March. And that's really a reflection of people starting to have a little bit of caution about how they're going to interact when there's this overlay of health concern. One thing that I've been doing, a slide that I didn't put in this deck, but that I've kind of been keeping on my computer, is basically an overlay of this data. So the COVID waves, along with what we saw in the previous slide here, the monthly employment change. And one thing that I've been able to notice, again, not a scientific study, just looking at that correlation, is that when we do see increases in COVID cases, we tend to see decreases in the amount of jobs that are gained that following month. So This has also been something we've been noticing at a national level as well. So COVID is still with us. It is still influencing the labor market, but as a whole, we're moving through it, and we're moving through it pretty quickly. This is a very messy slide, but I'm not going to go through each and every line on this slide, but it tells us a lot about what's been happening. Again, this is another thing that I've just kind of been putting together, adding to this slide every single month as we move forward to kind of keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening, who is experiencing the pandemic and pandemic economy in which ways, and which industry you're in makes a big difference. So, you know, in general, when we're looking at aggregated data, it gets messy. We're talking about the collection of experiences that people have and how this is playing out in aggregation. So one way to separate this out is just to look by industry and what that experience has been. So I will focus on a few of the outliers as a whole in terms of what the experience has looked like. Again, this is for Washington State. So the way we're going to read this slide is that I have marked the beginning of the recession, which was marked as February 2020, as 0.0. Everything, you know, that employment level is 100% right here. So that way I can normalize all of the different industries and say, well, let's see how they look when they're put next to each other. And right away, a couple things stand out. One, I mentioned that even before the April numbers showed up, we saw declines in employment in March in leisure and hospitality. Leisure and hospitality, of course, impacted more than any other. This is going to be our restaurants, bars, hotels, entertainment venues. Leisure and hospitality was absolutely hit the hardest in the pandemic early on and continues to be the industry that's struggling to the greatest extent. Leisure and hospitality lost about 40% of all jobs from February to April and has been climbing back. Now, just to put this into a little bit of context, when we were talking about the Great Recession back in 2008, it took 2 years for construction, which was the hardest hit industry at that time, to lose, to reach the lowest point of employment. And that was about 35% of jobs lost. And that was devastating. And construction, by comparison, is a much smaller industry. So this is one of our largest industries in terms of employment, and it fell 40% in a month. So just devastating impact. Of course, we know why. It has to do with, there are pieces of policy as far as, restaurants and dining rooms were shut down. And then policy was revised moving forward. And there's also the question about safety and face-to-face types of work. So what we've seen since then, I'll also point out, is this recovery, devastating losses, but a substantial recovery. Now, that said, substantial recovery 2 years later, we're still at more than 10% below where we were in 2020. So there's still a lot of ground to make up, but we've seen some substantial recoveries from leisure and hospitality, continuing to struggle. Again, people's habits have changed. Therefore, the demand has not come back quite as quickly for restaurants as it has for some other businesses. But overall, we're seeing 30, 40% improvements when we're looking year over year at the restaurant industry. A couple other industries that were hit really hard. Other services, that's this rust-colored line. This is going to be services including personal care services such as hair and nail salons. It's also going to be car mechanics and churches and synagogues and a lot of membership organizations. A lot of this is going to be focused on in terms of the numbers, we're seeing a lot of laundry and personal services. I'll go ahead and say I went through most of the pandemic without getting a haircut. A lot of us kind of a similar experience. And as people start to go back to work, we're starting to do dry cleaning again. We're starting to get our haircut regularly again. But this is an industry that, similarly to leisure and hospitality, relies on that face-to-face interaction and has been much slower to recover compared to most other industries. Another one that I think is really relevant to point out construction, that's this other rust-colored line, drops significantly and then bounces back. This was a industry that was hit very swiftly. This is also an industry that is usually hit hard during recessions. This time around was no exception, but bounced back quicker than any other industry, in large part because we went into this recession from a very strong standpoint. There was a lot of construction activity happening, a lot of contracts in place, and they needed to get right back to that same contract. It wasn't the lapse in contracts that we tend to see during most recessions. They needed to get right back to work. This is also an industry that is familiar with PPE, is familiar with taking safety measures, and was able to get up to speed really quickly. We've since had, there were questions early on about what this meant for the housing market, and we found out very quickly that the housing market just kept on at a clip. So that robust housing market locally has also continued to support construction. Construction is above where the industry was going into the recession at this point. Another one that I will point out that I think is really relevant, being neighbors to Snohomish County and having a lot of our workforce from Camano Island working in Snohomish County, manufacturing takes a very different pattern than most. Manufacturing is an industry that has had a lot of challenges, some COVID related with regard to, I'll go ahead and call it out, aerospace. We saw a lot of demand for aircraft, orders disappear, a lot of speculation and concerns about travel, and therefore that having its impact on the airline industry and therefore impacts locally on the manufacturing side. But of course, there were also other concerns preceding and unrelated to the pandemic that I'm not going to dive completely into because I'd be stepping out of my lane. But we know that there have been a lot of challenges with aerospace manufacturing in particular that led to some layoffs that happened a little bit later than most of the other layoffs. So while we see all the other lines trending up, we see manufacturing trending down and beginning to recover recently. I will also point out manufacturing is very diverse. So we're not just talking about aerospace, we're also talking about food manufacturing, which did well. We're talking about a lot of other industries that collectively saw that drop, but overall we're beginning to see recover. Okay, now jumping to the top of the graph, a couple industries that really stand out at the other end of the graph. Number one is information, this dark blue line up here. Now, information is mostly going to be concentrated in King County. This is going to be software. This is also going to be newspapers, movie theaters, software publishing. It's a very diverse industry, but in Washington State, a lot of this is tied up in a lot of high wage work, computer-focused work. In information, you can see was impacted just like everybody else early on. There was that jolt when we kind of were figuring out in April what was coming next. But as a whole, recovered very quickly and just kind of kept on at a clip. Information, both because people were able to work from home, they were able to leverage technology, but also because people were using their technology to a much greater extent. The fact that we're having this meeting virtually speaks to a learning curve that not only a lot of people were able to work from home, but now they really needed that support and that technology to facilitate working from home. So the information sector has actually done quite well during this time period. Another industry that stands out as having done very well as a whole, this light blue line dipped very quickly, but then recovered very quickly, retail trade. Now, when we're talking about retail trade, again, when we're looking at these aggregations, it's important to understand some of what's happening beneath the surface. Retail trade experience is going to be very different from a bricks and mortar clothing store that caters to people that are going to work in offices versus online retail, which of course in Washington State, we have a very large presence of online retail, which did quite well as people were shifting their shopping behaviors. We're also talking about grocery stores, pharmacies, businesses that were considered essential retail. And as we're seeing people shift from eating out and shopping more at their grocery stores. Retail as a whole actually did quite well. So there are a couple different stories here, and I could bring in all kinds of national data. I will just conversationally, but there's been a big difference in the experience based on how dependent is your work on face-to-face interactions? What is the risk of the new health overlay, that question about COVID? The face-to-face interactions, a lot of the businesses that were hit the hardest and are struggling to recover depend to a large extent on that face-to-face interaction. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got a lot of businesses doing very well in terms of employment stability that were able to leverage technology and have people work from home. I'm sitting at my kitchen table right now. So very different experiences depending on where you are in the technological environment. But of course, that question about, thinking through questions like retail, of course, with more people going to the grocery store, that's one piece that recovered very quickly. So a lot of different experiences depending on what industry you're in. This is the same data. I guess rather than normalizing it and looking at percentages, this is just looking at the absolute numbers, and no need to go through it in great detail, but I will point out, again, leisure and hospitality was hit the hardest by a long shot. That's the blue bar, is that initial February to May, recovered a very large number of jobs, but still has a long way to go. So, we're still seeing a lot of recovery that has to happen in this sector. Another thing that I'll point out is it's a large sector. We saw that proportional representation, and it looks a lot like the actual representation. This is a very large number of jobs. One thing that we've had to do this past 2 years, is kind of figure out, because there's a lag in the data, figure out different ways of looking at the data. And I just grabbed this screen capture from tracktherecovery.org. It's some economists out of Harvard that have been looking at different data sets to kind of fill in some of the gaps and understand with a little bit different nuance what kinds of things are happening. And so one thing that they've been looking at is the data that, employment data with that overlay of wages, and asking the question, which jobs have recovered, which jobs have not recovered. And we see, just looking at wages, people that were earning high wages tended to see a relatively shallow dip early on in the recession and recovered fairly quickly. And at this point, there's a larger number of jobs in the highest paid sectors than there were going into this recession. Middle wage, more or less evening out, a little bit lower than going in, but the low wage sectors are the ones that continue to struggle. It makes sense when we kind of intersect that and look at the previous slide. Again, which sectors are paid the most and paid the least? We saw information at the top. We saw leisure and hospitality at the bottom. All these different angles, these different windows into the situation tell us slightly different stories, but they all really do match up and tell us a similar story. Island County actually has done fairly well. One thing I'm going to point out, when we're looking at Island County, one of the questions that I've been asking as I look at some of the dynamics, especially with leisure and hospitality. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and say every single place, every single county I look at had devastating losses in leisure and hospitality. And so this is not intended to downplay that by any measure. But one thing that Island County did have going for it, and you can see actually Island County 2021 bars are in orange. They're actually over where we were in 2019. Island County, for all intents and purposes, has recovered using this metric. One of the things that Island County has had going for it is that there are a lot of people that commute off island that didn't necessarily commute during the pandemic. They were working from home. And so just looking at the leisure and hospitality sector, leisure and hospitality has been recovering more quickly in communities that have a large suburban presence, a large commuting presence than they have in Seattle, for example. So looking at Seattle, I was looking at recently at downtown Seattle restaurants, and they have yet to show any recovery, or at least a couple months ago, they had yet to show any recovery, whereas Island County has been recovering quite a bit, partially because people are not going downtown to eat their lunch. If they're going to be ordering lunch out, it's going to be where they live. And so the fact that there is a large residential population and a large industry base that's largely residentially focused has actually benefited Island County businesses as a whole. I'm not going to go into any great amount of detail on this slide, except to point out, as a whole, up 6.6% for total non-farm employment in Island County. We're up over 1,000 jobs compared to last year at this time. Usually when I'm looking at these numbers, I look at the year over year just to kind of tease out the seasonality. As a whole, we're seeing improvement. Manufacturing is down a bit, trade, transportation, utilities, but not retail, down a little bit. But as a whole, seeing quite a bit of recovery in most sectors. The other thing I'll point out is that usually when I'm reading these numbers, I'm looking at that percent and it's telling me about growth. This time around, it's telling me about how volatile and how deep of a hole they're digging out of by industry. So 34.9% growth from last year. Well, that's because last year there was such a deep hole to dig out of. These numbers really tell me more about the volatility of each sector. So, but as a whole, Island County looking pretty good compared to a lot of other counties in Washington State. I cannot get down to the level of Camano Island in most of our data sets, but we've got a little bit. So I'm going to go through that just a bit. First of all, this is a source called On the Map. It's basically combining our data with some census data. And what we can see is that for the most part, people are commuting off of Camano Island. The residents tend to work elsewhere and bring their paychecks home, which has been, again, part of the reason that the recovery has looked like it has in Island County. Just looking at taking a snapshot prior to the pandemic, this is looking at 2019, which sectors employ people in Camano Island, and we see the largest industries being construction. Again, construction bounced back fairly quickly compared to most other industries. Retail trade, another industry that bounced back fairly quickly. Accommodation and food services, which has not bounced back quickly, but again, with more people with that neighborhood orientation, has actually done better than in Island County than in some other places. But as a whole, you can see this orientation towards where people live. Looking at where people work, so people that are shifting from businesses in Camano Island to workers in Camano Island that may or may not work in Camano Island. What we see is that a fairly broad representation, the largest numbers being people working in manufacturing, retail trade, and healthcare and social assistance. Healthcare and social assistance, also one that was hit hard early on, but has seen a pretty decent recovery. Switching from jobs to people, unemployment and labor force, I'm going to have to give a little bit of definitions here. When we're talking about the unemployment rate, we're talking about the portion of the labor force. The labor force is the people who either have a job or are actively seeking employment. What portion of the labor force is actively seeking employment? And what this means is that we are leaving out people who are not in the labor force. So that's going to be an important part of the story as we look at some of these numbers. So the Island County unemployment rate was down to 3.7% in the most recent reading for December 2021. This is down significantly from 16.3% back in early 2020, and follows a very similar pattern to what we've seen statewide and in neighboring counties. As a whole, what we're talking about with the unemployment rate is really how well people are connecting with jobs. And this is, I think, where the story gets really interesting. Now, when thinking about a business perspective, businesses are looking at facing simultaneously the challenges of having to, seeing demand come back and having to hire and retool, hire a workforce back, which is usually, we always see this after a recession, but again, not usually as quickly in that V shape as we saw this time. So the challenges of hiring, usually there's this cushion, this time period of a high unemployment rate when employers can more easily connect with workers. But they're also facing simultaneous challenges of a strong labor market where employers are competing with each other for a relatively scarce labor force. So from an employer standpoint, same challenges they were facing in 2017, 2018, 2019. The low unemployment rate is accompanied by the challenge of having to ramp up. So it's a big challenge. Looking at the labor force, we saw a dip in the labor force. What I've done here is just cut the economy in half, Seattle area, King and Snohomish compared to the rest of Washington state. But what we can see is that in both cases, we saw a dip in the size of the labor force, and then we've seen some recovery, but that recovery happened much more quickly in King and Snohomish County than the rest of Washington state. And that we are still, we're seeing job growth, but we're struggling to connect with people. And this is where I think a lot of the questions of the pandemic really come in a meaningful way. We saw stresses both on the demand side and on the supply side, and demand came back much more quickly than supply. And I'm happy to kind of go into some of that after the slides as well. So looking at the return of jobs and some of the data that have been making headlines lately. If you've been paying attention to the news, you know that in the past several months, we've been hearing about job openings at record levels. And yes, it is true. This is what this looks like. Record numbers in this case, over 10 million jobs open. Now, what we tend to, we tend to see, well, this is, again, this is like physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. A lot of jobs disappeared, and now we're posting for those jobs and trying to hire back. There are an unprecedented number of job openings, absolutely. And that makes sense when we think about a swift V-shaped recovery. Hiring is up. This resonates with a lot of our other data as well. We are seeing people reconnecting in that labor force. Here you see that steep drop, and then you see a lot of people coming right back into the workplace. And then some variation over time, but we are seeing a lot of hiring. We're seeing fewer layoffs than normal. This slide is national data, but we also know, looking at the unemployment insurance claims data that are coming in, that we're seeing fewer unemployment insurance claims than we did at this time of the year in 2019. So involuntary separations or layoffs are below normal. And yes, the people are quitting their jobs in record numbers. And now this is an interesting one. When we're looking at why are people quitting their jobs, what's going on, a lot of things are going on. But overall, when we're looking at the quits rates, first of all, this is unprecedented. We've never seen it at this level. But we tend to see very low quits rates when the economy is weak, when the unemployment rate is high and people are, regardless of how satisfied they are in their job, if they're not feeling that they've got a really good chance at connecting with work, they're more likely to stick with their job. Right now, we've got a record number of job openings. We've got a lot of activity happening. We've got wages increasing, and we've got a lot of people moving from one job to another. A lot of people quitting their jobs. It's a fundamentally optimistic measure if you're thinking from the standpoint of workers, but of course presents a lot of challenges for workers or for businesses in terms of attraction and retention of the workforce. How long is this going to continue? That's anybody's guess. Again, if you remember, go back to the first slide, this is a very different pattern than what we're accustomed to seeing. But overall, when we think about how those pieces fit together, they really do fit together to a fairly cohesive story. Locally, looking at the Northwest Washington Workforce Development Area, Whatcom, Skagit Island, and San Juan counties, what we have seen, just kind of comparing unemployment insurance claims data with job postings, that orange line, are on the rise, and unemployment insurance claims have dropped significantly. We're back to something that looks a lot more normal, but we're still in that time period when there's a lot of volatility, a lot of change happening very quickly. Really quick plug. This is where you can find my contact information and all the data that I've been referencing at the labor market website at ESD. And that is where I'm going to open it up for discussion or hand it off to our next speaker. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today.
Thank you, Annalise. Really appreciated that. There's just so much information, and it's really interesting to see how all those pieces do actually fit together. We have a couple questions. So what I'm going to do is read the questions to you. And so Mona asked, is there data showing employment opportunities, although employment numbers are low, they don't reflect the actual jobs out there? And that was kind of earlier on, so I don't know if Mona's question was answered, but.
Okay, so I guess I would just, employment opportunities, I guess that would be the job openings piece. And yes, there is data out there to show the number of job openings. We know nationally and locally that we're seeing an unprecedented number of job openings, a lot of those in the industries that were most impacted early on, which makes sense when we think about what that data is telling us. It's, yes, you've got information, for example, that's continued to grow at a fairly steady pace, but a lot of it's that recovery, and we do have data on that.
Did that answer your question, Anna? I can see you nodding.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You actually answered it earlier. I'm sorry I asked it so early, but thank you. Yes, that was great.
Okay, great. Jessie was asking if the data on retail differentiates brick and mortar versus online retail.
Somewhat. And this is where, for this presentation, I didn't dive into those specifics, but I'm happy to also, go into a deeper dive with you, and you're welcome to contact me. I'll leave my contact information in the chat. But yes, when we look at the difference between clothing retailers and grocery stores, for example, it's just a very different pattern. Amazon, I should never name businesses outright. Online retailers, such as a very large one that's based in Seattle, actually has done very well. I think one thing that doesn't get captured in the data, though, is that there are a lot of qualitative and technological changes that are happening too. So you might have a bricks and mortar store, but you've over time adjusted to more online sales. That's not necessarily going to get captured in this data. So that's where kind of that qualitative understanding of what's going on meets the data or doesn't. Some industries obviously can do more online than others. But that's a qualitative piece that kind of gets missed by the data itself.
Great. And then Carol asked if there are stats on how many people have chosen self-employment instead of returning to jobs.
That is an excellent question. And self-employment is a really hard one to capture. We can get that implicitly on the on the unemployment and labor force side, but we don't capture it in covered employment, in the payroll side, because the payroll data is based on traditional employment arrangements. So if I could wave my magic wand and get anything I wish for, one of my big wishes would be reliable self-employment statistics, because that's really hard to get a handle on.
So I think she just added, would business license applications show that?
Yes. However, one of the challenges with business license applications is if somebody is I guess the question of, Is this business something that is is it going to be an active business, or is it, I guess, the business activity itself is challenging to capture in that. I'm actually hopping on a call in the next couple of weeks with somebody from Department of Commerce and Department of Revenue, and we're going to kind of see if there are ways we can look at taxes and questions along business licenses, but it's messy and it's a challenging one. But I'm on the same page with you. That is one data source that's a difficult one to wrangle, but it is one that has a lot of promise.
Great. All right. Thank you. So I think that's it for the questions. If anyone thinks of any more, just feel free to pop them in the chat. But Annalise, thank you again so much for that information. So we are going to transition to discuss childcare, which really goes kind of hand in hand with what we've been discussing. And I'm going to introduce Jessie Gunn, who has served as the Executive Director of Whidbey Community Foundation since January 2022. She joined WCF in April 2019 as a program manager and then served as the program director through 2021. WCF is also the fiscal sponsor for Partners of Young Children, a coalition focused on improving the well-being of children and families in Island County. Jessie also serves as the PYC County lead. Jessie has over 15 years of experience in the social sector, having worked with the national foundations, government programs, nonprofits, and corporate philanthropy. Prior to her work with WCF, she was a grants manager with Ballmer Group. Jessie earned her master's degree in public administration from the Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington, specializing in nonprofit management. Jessie is the mother of 2 young children, and she and her husband own and operate a small business on Whidbey Island, Whidbey Pies. So thank you, Jessie, for joining us. I'm going to hand it off to you if you have some presentation to share, or
I do, yeah. Thank you for the warm introduction, and I will, bear with me, I will also share my screen. Let me see here. So I should be able to see that. Is that right?
Yep, you got it.
Great. Well, thank you again, Jessica and Annalise, for the really fantastic presentation. I think it really introduced this quite well. So yes, I am going to be presenting today the state of childcare in Island County. And I don't have to go into too much detail about who we are, because I think Jessica gave a good intro. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Whidbey Community Foundation and PYC, we're both relatively new organizations. Whidbey Community Foundation was formed in 2016, and our mission is to improve the quality of life on Whidbey Island. And we provide support for the nonprofit sector. We assist donors with their charitable purposes, and then we help meet community needs through financial awards. And then in 2020, Partners for Young Children, which is the coalition made up of private, nonprofit, government agencies, service organizations, all focused on the well-being of children and families, with a focus on early learning and family supports, ages prenatal through 3rd grade, thereabouts. And so WCF is, as of 2020, the fiscal sponsor for PYC. And as Jessica mentioned, I am also serving as the county lead for our PYC coalition. So a little bit of background about this presentation and the information. So last year, in the beginning of 2021, Island County Public Health received a grant from the Department of Commerce in Washington State, and that was to form the Island County Child Care Partnership Task Force. And the task force comprised of different community stakeholders, including parents, child care providers, early childhood experts, businesses, And all of us came together to both assess the current state of childcare in the county, as well as make recommendations to improve access to quality, affordable, and equitable childcare across the county. We received really great response to our community surveys that we conducted last year. We also did listening groups, and we worked with Washington STEM and folks in public health in Island County worked together on pulling public data to support some of these findings as well. The recommendations, which I'll get to at the end, they really are focused both locally as well as for state and regional policy as well. And I like to, I think it's hard to know. Different audiences I've spoken with have different kind of backgrounds in childcare. And so I always like to get everyone on the same page around why early learning and childcare matter so much. So quality, in particular quality childcare, is essential to overall community health. Many studies state that the conditions and the environments where people are born, where they live, work, play, worship, and age in, that all affect the wide range of health and functioning and quality of life and outcomes and risks. On the economic side of things, childcare options are needed to ensure children have access to developmentally supportive settings while parents go to work. Parents need safe and stable childcare to work and make sure their child's potential is maximized. As Annalise mentioned, our region is home to vital manufacturing, medical, and social service industries alongside a considerable presence of the U.S. Navy. And childcare that meets the needs of the local families in our region ensures that we retain and strengthen our economic vitality and equitable support for our diverse populations. And on the employer side of things, they need childcare so that we can ensure an adequate workforce that's present and able to flourish and help grow the economy. One piece of information also on this that I like to provide that is quite stark is, despite the critical role of childcare and the success of K through 12 system and our local economy, there's been no official investment in the childcare business development side of things since the Great Recession in 2008. So even prior to the pandemic, access to childcare in Island County has declined. So in 2008, there were approximately 100 licensed childcare providers, that's both center-based and at-home licensed childcare in the county. And since then, that number has declined to about 30. So there's been a severe shortage of licensed childcare, and that impacts our economic development as well. So getting into the needs assessment from the task force last year, there's some key findings that I'll just pull out. And I'll also state that the full report and all of the full findings, full narratives around that, more data, charts, and things like that are available on Island County Public Health's website. And I'm happy at the end to throw some links in the chat to those as well. So here you can see in Island County, we're home to over 6,000 young children and their families. So that's children under the age of 6. And one piece of information I like to point out is that in this population, the under 6, there is more racial and ethnic diversity in our younger population when you compare that to Island County's population of all ages as a whole. Another piece on the affordability side of childcare. So the data from last year showed that the median wage for Island County is about $68,000 per year. And on that, the self-sufficiency wage for a family of 4 in the county is about $72,000. What the study found was that the typical cost of childcare in Island County costs a family about $13,000. And the vast majority of families, if they had 2 working parents, would need to have both adults making over $36,000 a year in order to begin to afford typical cost of care. Another piece of information that's interesting is that Island County is actually higher in cost for childcare on average than our neighboring Skagit and Snohomish counties. So you can see in the chart here that childcare actually makes up more like 19%. Childcare costs make up more than 19% of the median income for a household in our county. And the Washington State Department of Commerce states that childcare should really cost no more than 7% of a household's income. Another point I'll make here is you can see the racial variance and that there's much higher burden on certain groups in the county for cost of childcare. This is an interesting diagram I like to show on the cost of childcare as well. So you can see here on the vertical axis, the cost of care, and then on the horizontal axis, family income. So you'll see on the yellow line that follows the chart at the bottom here, in theory, the cost of childcare is very low for, or close to zero for low-income families. And that's because subsidies are available at the state level for those families. And as you go across the chart, you start to see these big spikes. So there's one as you approach $40,000, and another as you start to approach the $60,000 to $80,000 range. So one of the most impactful elements of this chart that I like to point out is that for a family of four in Island County, they would need to make over $288,000 a year in order for childcare to be at that 7% of their income. And as I mentioned in the last slide, 7%, that comes from various studies, but also the Department of Health and Human Services state that in order for childcare to be sustainable for families, it really should cost no more than 7% of their income. So as I mentioned before, right now with the median income, with families spending about 19% of their income and $68,000 being about the median income for a family, that $288,000 a year really seems pretty impossible to reach so that a family has childcare as a sustainable cost. Another thing the study found is there's been a really low uptick of families using those subsidies available to them from the state. And that's unclear if it's because of a lack of promotion, so families knowing they have access to that benefit, or if providers themselves aren't taking that subsidy. So the study found that only about 5% of eligible families are using the childcare subsidies that they qualify for, and that's the Working Connections Childcare, and it's run through the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So on access, currently licensed childcare meets the demand of only about 11% of parents in the workforce. And you can see that demand is quite high on the infant toddler side of childcare. In this publicly available data that was used for the study, the military data is a little bit tricky and it wasn't included there, but we did on our task force have a contact with the military, and they did offer some additional numbers. So the unmet need they provided on preschool care is about 716 slots from data last summer. And on the school age side of care, the missing slots are about 254 children. And then the last point I'll make on this slide that I think is really striking is in order to meet the full need of our childcare demand, we would have to add an additional 460 educators, and that's not including administrative support. So this heat map is also another way of looking at that data. The Oak Harbor zip code that you see here is a bit erroneous, as I mentioned, with the data not being available from the military when we pulled this. But you can see here, for instance, in the Clinton zip code, there was no zero childcare based on the data last year. Just as an anecdotal piece, I do know of one recent childcare provider that opened in the Clinton area in the past few months. And then pretty much the rest of the map, in particular Camino, you can see the severe lack of childcare that meets demand. So as I mentioned, we did local surveys in addition to pulling the public data, and we did surveys both of parents and guardians as well as providers. On the parents and guardians survey results, we actually got a pretty good outcome for local surveys of about 445 respondents. About a quarter of those respondents identified as non-white, and the majority of respondents were actually co-parent. The data biased to show folks who are co-parenting and not as representative to single parent households. And while there was a range of incomes represented, the survey did included people more on the higher bracket of that income range. I think another interesting takeaway from this survey and the results was that families actually prefer licensed center-based care as opposed to other options such as home-based or more informal options like family, friends, or neighbors. And then finally, a disparity that was shown in the data was that 0% of Latinx parents had their preferred type of childcare. 37% of multiracial parents reported they were using their preferred type, and that's compared to 59% of reported white parents. And then a huge difference also at income levels in terms of preferred childcare. So those with higher incomes were more likely to report they were using their preferred type of childcare. So again, some data to support the system, not necessarily supporting our most vulnerable populations. And then we did surveys on the provider side, and we surveyed 20 providers. And the biggest piece that we saw from the data was staffing as a consistent challenge in terms of hiring qualified and competent staff. This also came up in listening sessions and in interviews. There was a real desire on the provider part of wanting to pay people appropriately and just not being able to. Not being able to hire staff who will stay because of housing costs is also a real issue. And a big piece of this we're continuing to see is people being able to pay teachers livable wage and having that issue compounded by the severe shortage of affordable housing in our community. I recently spoke with a provider who said, you know, it's one thing to get the funding to increase our teacher wages, but then it doesn't really matter if they don't have a place to live. Also, those working in childcare and having their own children and not being able to pay for childcare themselves is a real issue. And then finally, you know, in the listening data, we really heard that childcare providers are feeling frustrated that the profession is not seen as a profession and that it's not really subsidized in the same way K through 12 education is, not prioritized in the same way, even though the data supports how important it is for our future generations and our communities. I also just wanted to put a plug in of childcare as a small business. So you can see the system isn't necessarily supporting the true cost of care. You can see here that the cost of quality childcare per child is about $24,000, and the max subsidy allowed for at-home care is a little over $9,000 or close to $10,000, whereas in the counties, about 75% charge less than that or equal to $9,000. And then finally, some of the COVID impacts we've seen on the childcare business as a business. We saw 14 childcare programs temporarily close. Many of them have since reopened, but that was during the past 2 years. 36% estimated a capacity loss of 430 slots, and then 8 childcare programs, which equated to about 81 jobs, received paycheck protection loans. So just a summary of the needs assessment, we see, as I mentioned, a real lack of infant care that stands out. How many people who would use childcare if it was there, so the real high demand. And then really, I think the workforce issue stands out with that 460 additional educators that would be needed to meet the demand. So as I mentioned, we pulled together some recommendations in addition to the needs assessment. I'll list a summary of the recommendations. There were formally a total of 6 that we put together. And as I mentioned, there's a more exhaustive narrative available in the full report that I'll link to. And then as I mentioned, the data I can also link to at the end. So the first recommendation was really around facilities. Really getting the actual physical space for childcare has been a real barrier to Island County. It's the cost, it's the code, it's the different licensing hurdles. All of these pieces make one big hurdle, and it's disincentivized providers to really move forward with trying to obtain the physical space to provide childcare. So there were a number of action items that the task force suggested, and one of those was helping to revise the code in the Island County Planning Department and having them look at code and try to streamline that a bit more. Also bringing in support from the Northwest Center for Childcare Retention and Expansion. So this is a recent shop that is under the umbrella of Opportunity Council serving our 5-county region, and helping that they might be able to help providers in trying to buy or use facilities for childcare. There's also been a lot of talk about co-location childcare in buildings that are being planned or renovated, or additionally with workforce housing that's being planned. The second recommendation was on training and education. So this really dovetails into the feedback we got from providers about wanting highly trained staff and having a lot of barriers around that. Even providing training and incentivizing training is a real challenge when they're strapped for time and money. So the task force felt like an Island County childcare provider network that met regularly and could advocate for childcare providers, and also be sort of a hub for providing training. There's also been discussion in multiple counties about a shared services model. And this would be to share the burden of both the training and the admin side of childcare. There's actually an active model, this shared services in King County, and then one that's developed at the state level through a contract from the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. I recently looked into it, and I believe the host or the contractor is the Imagine Institute, and they're currently serving as the state's shared services hub, which connects licensed family childcare providers and childcare centers to resources and services to help grow their businesses, connect them to fellow providers, and provide free access to training and expert services. So I can link to that model as well at the end here. The third recommendation was on funding, which I think goes without saying in a lot of ways, but just some of the real dedicated funding to childcare. Locally, our task force actually advocated to our Island County commissioners for dedicated ARPA dollars. That's the American Rescue Plan dollars that came down to the county. I believe the total amount that came to Island County was about $16 million. And I think a real win there has been that $2 million was allocated from Island County toward a collection of community grants, and they identified childcare as a priority funding area. Awardees were announced just this past month, and I believe at least 500,000 went toward childcare programs, including 2 on Camino, which were the Lutheran Church childcare program, as well as the newly opened Springwood Outdoor School, which is the first licensed outdoor preschool in the county. And a fellow task force member, Heather White, has recently opened that program. Another area worth exploring for funding is local levies. And this has been done successfully in King County with their Best Start for Kids levy. And really the goal here is to have early learning funding near levels at the K through 12 education. The fourth recommendation was around access, recognizing the various barriers people have to access high quality childcare and how we can lower barriers in terms of education and outreach. One area on the outreach side has been to the local business community, to explore, potentially employer-based childcare incentives and extended parental leave policies. And another area has been outreach and education to increase the use of that state subsidy, Working Connections childcare, both outreach to the families as well as providers. 5 was on quality. So again, trying to promote quality in the childcare program is being really important. There's been some feedback from presentations like these that suggest, childcare is really just like babysitting, and why is quality important? So this is really a lens and an emphasis from the task force that wants to promote Island County having really high quality care for our community and for our children. Again, within this recommendation was having a childcare provider network and making training more accessible. And then the last recommendation was on additional local advocacy. So this comes back to looking at new building projects and seeing if we can co-locate Can we integrate childcare programs into local schools? It's a convening role in bringing the topic of childcare up in front of more and various audiences and policymakers and business leaders. And I think, with the Build Back Better at the federal level not moving forward, local advocacy really is more important than ever. So in terms of just the current focus, where we've been and where we are since the fall approximately of last year. So there's been on the table the possibility of year 2 funding from the Department of Commerce. So as you'll recall, the task force and many communities around the state got the similar funding to do a needs assessment and recommendations. So year 2 funding has sort of been on the table and we're still on hold there. One of our task force members continued some of these conversations through quarter 4 of 2021, including conversations with Oak Harbor School District about co-location of childcare in buildings there. I think since the recent levy for Oak Harbor didn't pass, I'm not entirely sure of the immediate viability there, particularly since the levy would have had such a significant match funding from, I think, about 140 million for the military. And that bond would have funded construction of 3 new elementary schools and a new early childhood learning center. So those projects really would have upgraded facilities and brought schools closer to the kids they serve. I know the planning director in Island County has on their radar to look at childcare code for the 2022 work plan. So there's some follow-up there that needs to happen. And since the task force officially lived under Island County Public Health last year, its continuation has moved under the helm of PYC here at the Community Foundation. So we're currently working on ways we can continue some momentum. And one of those is work on building that childcare network with providers. So we'll be reaching out to as many childcare providers in the county soon. And then in terms of creative workforce solutions, we've had some conversations with folks like Skagit Valley College on how to bring early childhood apprenticeship programs to the county. There's some really creative ways this has been done in other communities, like in Northern California and North Carolina. So really trying to learn from our neighbors and understand what makes sense for our community. So I think that's all I had for my presentation, and I'd be happy to chat more or answer any questions. And then, well, as I said, I'll throw those links in the chat or give them to Jessica to send out an email to folks afterwards.
Great, thank you, Jessie. There's just so much information there. And I think Carol put in the chat that this plays into why some people may not have returned to jobs if they can't get adequate or affordable care. How do they go back to work?
Exactly.
Which is exactly the point. And then you throw in affordable housing into all of this as well, and it just becomes a domino effect. So I appreciate all of the information. I know that you brought up the Lutheran Church Preschool as well as Springwood Forest School getting some of that funding. So the Lutheran Preschool serves infants as well as toddlers, I believe. Is that right?
I don't know. I don't have that information at my fingertips. Maybe folks on this call know better than I if they do, in fact, serve infant. Through conversations, I do recall that being said. So I am almost certain they also,
okay.
Yeah.
And then do you want to speak a little bit about what Springwood Forest School is, since that's a new one? So the Lutheran one is reopening. They've existed here. But Springwood Forest is, I'm a little jealous because I think it goes up to age 10, right?
Oh gosh, I wish Heather was on the call. I know she's planning to, so I'm going to do my best to promote her work. So my understanding is they start at preschool. So I think the youngest age they start at is about 2 or 3. I don't know how old they go up to. 10 sounds about right, but don't quote me on it. It might. I know they have a website, so I'm sure that can give more accurate information. And I believe they're open Monday through Friday. And as I said there, so in terms of policy at the state level, it became state policy that fully outdoor programs can now be licensed. And that's huge because licensed programs get additional support from the state if you go through the process of being a licensed provider. And so the fact that this one is fully outdoor and fully licensed, I think is a real neat innovation, and that it's happening in Island County is also really neat. And as far as I know from Heather recently, that she just started the program. So I think just the month of February it started. They're taking children, so they may have a wait list. They may just be enrolling at the moment. And I know they're also looking to hire teachers as well.
And are they out at Four Springs? Am I right with that? Yeah. Okay.
I don't know.
So yeah, people are nodding their heads. So they're holding it out at Four Springs Preserve.
Got it.
Which is it's a really amazing. Again, my kids are older than 10, so I would have loved that when they were younger. And Janet St. Clair told me that, I don't know if this is accurate, but that it was the first licensed outdoor preschool in the state.
I think that, I know that's the case for the county, and I think that's the case for the state. I mean, one of the really neat things, I was on the call when the commissioners were discussing the slate of grants for those ARPA dollars, and they were, deciding who to fund, and among them were different childcare programs. And when Springwood came up, they decided to fund the full amount that was requested for Springwood. And part of that including helping Heather get a new truck that would help her transport everything back and forth, because she has to schlep. She's all outdoor in the public park. She has to schlep all of that. So I think that was a real win for her program and for families on Camino.
Great. And my little researcher behind the scenes is saying the Camino Lutheran Church is 2 to 12. So.
Oh, okay. So not infants. So really just a total lack of infant care on the island.
Okay, yeah, I believe so. But at least it seems like we're moving in the right direction with both of those opening. Does anyone else have any specific questions for Jessie or Annalise? Carol, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, are you seeing kind of a demographic shift on Camino? I with my yoga studio, I'm starting to get more inquiries about, Heather contacted me about doing some yoga there at, for the outdoor preschool. And I've had requests about like mommy and me yoga, and our demographic in the past has been more retirement age, and do we have numbers on new families on the island or anything? Or
so and maybe Annalise has more in her back pocket. Anecdotally, I can speak a bit more to Whidbey, and I do know that that's the case. I think it's the case. It can be said across all of Island County, and I think there's a lot of elements at play around, folks having more flexibility with remote work, and they're able to move kind of outside of these city hubs. But I don't have the actual data to support that necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, as far as having the data, I don't have it at my fingertips, but I would be happy to connect with you and, dig a little bit deeper into some of the different data that we can look at. But I do think that, Jessie makes a really good point that there are a lot of shifting patterns. And as some of us are able to work from home, that does make a bit of a difference in terms of what that daytime population looks like and what opportunities are open to people.
Right. And I think anecdotally, we're seeing the same thing, right? It's not just a retirement community anymore. We're seeing more young families move here, but it would be interesting maybe I could reach out to the school district too. It wouldn't meet the younger kids, but it would be interesting to know what the enrollment has been looking like at the school district locally too.
Does the YMCA have anything for, really young kids in terms of childcare?
I do not know the answer to that off the top of my head. I don't feel like they have like full-time during work, maybe it's while you're at the Y childcare, but if anyone knows the answer to that, I don't know the answer. I know there is a daycare. There's a couple in Stanwood, right? So we're in an interesting position because we do bridge over to Stanwood. So there are some opportunities, more opportunities in Stanwood for childcare than there are locally right here on Camino.
Yeah.
All right.
Thing is affordability.
and that's key. You already got it. Okay, the website for information for job stats is there. So I will send out the recording of the presentation, as well as Jessie and Annalise will send me their slides and any links. That will go out to the membership. It also goes on our website so that you guys can access this. But I thank both of you for a great meeting. I have a couple quick announcements before we go. If you didn't know, GlassQuest is starting tomorrow. If you don't know that, I don't know what to tell you, but they're coming. So get ready. Our social media channels are going absolutely bananas. A couple weeks ago, the Facebook page for GlassQuest was at about 6,900 followers, and it's now at like 8,500. So if we get to that 10,000 mark this year, I don't know what I'm going to do, but celebrate and scream at the same time. But it's really exciting. So thank you to all of you that are participating. Even if you're not participating, just welcome the guests to the area. And this is an event we do in February to draw people to Stanwood and Camino and encourage them to shop here and explore here, because all of our businesses need help, especially in February. So they're coming, so get ready. Our March meeting is going to be one of our favorite that we have every year. It's going to be on Zoom still, but the FBLA students are going to present for our March membership meeting, and that's always a great one. They love your support. And then we're also going to have a presentation about the history of Camano Island as well. Want to just remind you, if you want to be featured in our newsletter, just shoot me an email and let me know. We send our newsletters out on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of the month and feature 3 different members each time. So if you want to be scheduled to be featured, all I need is 100 words and an image and your logo and any links that you want to include. So please let me know if you want to be in there. And then after GlassQuest, we've got a couple of new initiatives that we're starting, one of which is the Welcome to Camino podcast. And this came out of an idea of a discussion that I had with Marla Hegel from Windermere. So Windermere and the Chamber and Brandon Erickson from the Camino Marketplace, who also does the Camino Voice, we're going to all work together and produce a Welcome to Camino podcast series. So the first one will be probably in April, I think is what we're aiming for, once a month and maybe more, depending on what we can get. But it was a great idea. I think there's a lot of people moving here, right? And even the people who have been here, we still welcome you to Camano Island, even if you've been here forever. So I just want to encourage anyone, if you have ideas like that, just bring them to us. We love to collaborate with other businesses. We can't promise we can do everything, but we can sure try our best. So if you have ideas of things that you want to see from the chamber, just let me know. All right, any other questions? Okay, well, I appreciate everyone being here. It's almost 1 o'clock, so that was a great meeting. Thanks so much and have a great day.